While we do this, I'll just actually give you the first slide, which is a little bit about the context in which I work. So, as noted, I'm the founding director of the Amherst College Press, and for those of you who don't know much about the American context, I've spent the last 5 years trying to build an open access monographic press in the humanities in the United States. And coming here, I feel as though I have re-entered kindergarten, because your conversation is so far ahead of the conversation that I am typically in the US. When I first went to the Association of University Presses meeting in 2014, open access was very much a red-headed stepchild, and we were sort of given rooms off to the side of the meeting site to have our gatherings in. This year, we actually had a half-a-day meeting in advance of the conference where a lot of larger presses were gathered to talk about open access. So we're finally catching up, but we're still behind. So please understand, listening to me, coming from an American context, working with people in the humanities, and being in monographic work, you're listening to somebody from the trailing edge of your movement, okay? Please be patient with me. One other thing that you ought to know, though, about the context that I come from is that before I came to Amherst, I worked for 5 years running a university-wide behavioral science laboratory at Harvard. So I am really interested in the non-rational aspects of decision-making, which is a good thing to be interested in when you're in my job. And I'm really interested in what it is that gets in the way of making change, like the change to open access. So that's the background for what I'm going to be saying here. And we're now restarting. This is what we're doing with the time that otherwise had been Lara's. We're trying again.
Sorry.
We'll deal with the color. It's cool. Yeah. Okay, just full screen that. You're the best. Okay, good. So this is pretty much what I just said. As noted, so we created this model for how to do a platinum open access press at Amherst College. The idea is the library pays. That's it. As Sven was noting, there is this question about print income for open access publishers. By and large, most university presses in the United States make 80 to 90% of their revenue from sales in the market, and roughly 10% of their revenue from subsidy from the institution. We are literally flipping that model. So my subsidy is the revenue that I get from print sales. It's gravy. The core funding that I receive is from the library. And we took this model and then went to liberal arts colleges around America to try to describe it. This is, for some of you, a mystery, the idea of an institution that's exclusively undergraduate. And these are people who typically don't have a seat at the table of scholarly publishers. We're giving them an opportunity to be a press among presses by linking together as a consortium. So that's the background. Now, starting out, launching a press, the librarians who funded us thought, this will be easy. We'll put up a shingle, we'll join the Association of University Presses, and authors will beat down our doors with their manuscripts dying to get published. This turns out not to be true. Starting a new press in a prestige-driven economy is a difficult proposition. And so what we found was that we were engaged in an argument about open access, which was very poorly understood among academics. Most of what they understood was shaped by things like this. Maybe you've seen all of these things. They come out of the New Yorker and the New York Times and the Economist, and finally my favorite webcomic was published in the National Academy of Proceedings. So it's like we're having a hard time dissociating ourselves from the reputational problem of open access, which in a phrase is this: open access means it's not peer reviewed, doesn't it? Doesn't that what that means? Now, we all know that isn't true, but we also, you just need to understand in the world that I live in, that is strongly the reputation. And if you are, not to mention Voldemort here, if you are Elsevier, you have 6.1 billion reasons to make sure that reputation sticks. So we quickly came to see that we needed to be very clear that this is false. But we also realized that, we're a very small press, we don't have that many people, and we didn't have enough personnel to send one person to a conference a week, to speak at a panel a week, to say open access does not necessarily mean bad peer review. We had to do something different to change the conversation. So the first thing I tried to do right before the meeting of Associated University Presses this year was to write a little piece suggesting a different approach to peer review, one in which we would all be very clear about what are the standards that we follow when we say something is peer reviewed, and then to share that information with the reader. You can't see, because it traumatized me, the responses that I got to this that are appended as comments below this screen grab, many of which came from a name that some of you will know, Joe Esposito. But they were really, really incendiary and largely negative from the sort of traditional staid, high reputation university presses. So when I gave this talk at AUP, this was the next slide I put in, which is a slide of my dog, just to show that I still have one friend. Okay. But what I found was I got an audience among some really important traditional publishers because they understand that it's not just my problem as an open access press, that we are dealing with this reputational issue. Suddenly, all of the people on the right-hand side of the screen are living in a world in which a lot of people in my country think there's no effective difference here between really, really irresponsible outlets for information and peer-reviewed scholarship. And that is a problem for all of us. So now I had friends that I didn't know I had before who were willing to work with me. And that turned out to be a huge advantage. So we got together, a little group, myself and Amy Brand, the director of the MIT Press, and began to think that maybe the best fix to this problem was simply transparency. And our sort of founding document was something that few of you may know about, but it's a document that emerged out of a meeting held in 2000 in Tempe, Arizona, that was organized by the Association of Research Libraries and the Association of University Presses. And the basic question was, okay, we see digital is coming. We can't stop it from happening anymore. We don't know what it's going to mean. We can't control it, but we need to set down some mile markers here to keep things kind of on the rails as we move into this new digital world. One of the things that document, the report of this meeting, says as a recommendation for the principles that should shape our new forms of scholarly communication is this. The system of scholarly publishing must continue to include processes for evaluating the quality of scholarly work, peer review, and every publication should provide the reader with information about evaluation the work has undergone. Now that second piece is what I want you to focus on. Because how do we do that as publishers of books? Like, how do we do that? If you're most publishers, the way you do it is the author writes an acknowledgement section, and in the second to last paragraph of the acknowledgements, you will read something like, I would also like to thank 3 anonymous reviewers who provided helpful comments on earlier drafts of this book. But that's not a system. That's just good manners. So we thought we need to take this and figure out a way to systematize it in a way that publishers could share. And by the way, this is not just a matter for publishers, this is a matter for libraries. So this is what happens if I search for myself in the library catalog of Amherst College, where I work. And what you're going to see is there's a list of articles here on the right-hand side. I wrote the first 3 of them. And boy, really helpfully here, the catalog allows me to filter all of these for peer-reviewed work. The only problem is none of those 3 articles were peer-reviewed. So the library, a research library, which has as part of its mission teaching students to discern the difference between peer-reviewed scholarship and other, bought this happy little tool from EBSCO, which basically represents nothing of value. So libraries need to be interested in this problem too, because they have an educational mission around scholarly publishing. So sadly, I just skipped over the critical funding slide here, which was the way of saying thank you to a person already mentioned in this meeting, Melissa Hageman, who gave us a grant from Open Society Foundations to begin convening a group of publishers, librarians, scholars in the field, leaders of learned societies, and technologists, especially some good people from Crossref, yay, to talk about how could we make this a system? Like what would the pieces be and what would it take? And I'm happy to say that some of the people here in the meeting with us during these 3 days were at that meeting as well. Anything about this that you like goes to them, and anything about this that you question you should direct to me. But that includes Kristen Rattan, who spoke yesterday, and Tony Rossalauer, and Danny Kingsley, and I think I've seen others, but if I've missed you, I'm sorry. Here's where we started. We have figured out a very good way, you have figured out a really good way to do clear signaling about rights. This is the way we used to do it. It looks like this, we all know it. This is the way we do it now. And for all of you, this is elementary stuff, but each one of these conveys to the reader or the user a pretty complex set of ideas about what they're allowed to do with the thing in their hands. And we all know that this is what that does. This is what that accomplishes. I would actually say there's 4 layers of licenses here, because one of the layers is actually the little image, the sort of videograph here that shows you, that tells you all of this information in a very concise way. Okay, so the good news here is, and at this point I need to say, I did this whole presentation before I ever met Kristen Rattan, just saying. Nature turns out to give us a perfect form for the idea of collaborative work. And the process of peer review is essentially a work of the scholarly commons. This is what we do as scholars. It's one of the things you're expected to do as a citizen of the academy. And that form is a hexagon. So what if we could figure out a way to do what we've already figured out to do with rights and signal to readers a pretty complex set of ideas in a simple way that would link itself to layers of meaning? It might look like this. And it might give us a way of saying a double-blind peer review, a single-blind peer review, a peer-to-peer review, an edited volume of people who exchange papers, an open review with a managed process in the middle of selected reviewers, or a wide-open review. This is Kathleen Fitzpatrick's comment press idea, where you post the entire manuscript and let all comers come and comment on it. This, too, would have layers of information, right? There's an image, but it would have to be linked to a definition. What does this mean? What do we mean when we say double-blind? Or, preferably, if we don't want to use sort of ableist language, fully closed. What does that mean? And ideally, we could include this in the metadata of the scholarly object so that when it's cataloged, librarians would be able to do a better job of distinguishing what is really peer-reviewed work. Crossref is already working with us on this, and I learned only after this meeting about Hermeos. Thank you, host. So I have a lot more to learn. I'm glad to be here, but we're hoping we can get a conversation going to do this together. So, for example, how could we deploy this? Just notional. This is not final, but here's an idea. On the copyright page of a work that I publish, I could say to the reader, this is a peer-reviewed manuscript that was subjected to a single blind review by 3 reviewers. This is like 90% of the books that are published in university press world. Or we could say, this work began as a peer-reviewed proposal, pretty typical step in monograph world, that was subjected to a double-blind review and then became a manuscript that was subjected to a single-blind review followed by an open review. Or we could say the same thing and show that those 2 final steps were conducted simultaneously. If you know, I'm sure you do, Kathleen Fitzpatrick's work on planned obsolescence, this is what we would have put on that book. Or let's say an article. This is a journal article, the manuscript of which was reviewed double-blind by 2 reviewers with a data set that was made available for open review, because we review data sets too. The point is, to make this work, this system would have to be modular, because not all publishers publish in the very same way or with the very same process. It would have to be extensible, because we kind of know what double-blind, single-blind, peer-reviewed, we know what those mean. We can pretty easily come to consensus about defining those things. But open forms of review, many different approaches to that. A lot more conversation that needs to be had about identifying specific themes in these. It would have to be scalable. I publish 10 books a year. There are places that publish thousands of articles a year. If we get this right, it's the same basic set of ideas that could be applied across those two use cases. Most important to me, this would be the responsibility of a community to patrol. This is not something that Amy, Brandon, Mark, Edington are going to do. We're beginning a conversation. We're not owning this at all. And finally, it would visually reflect the important fact that peer review is the sort of collegial essence of scholarly communication. One quick last slide just to say, when we started this conversation about peer review, what we found is everybody likes to hate peer review or likes to tell you what is wrong with peer review. And believe me, I've heard it. So I can tell you all the problems that we are not claiming to solve with this, okay? They are such things at, we need to credit the labor of peer review. I think that's right, but I don't have a solution for that in what I'm describing here. We need to diversify the pool of reviewers, absolutely true, different set of conversations. The institutions we work for need to acknowledge that we are doing peer review. I agree, but I can't solve that here. We need to shift to open peer review as a norm and away from closed forms of review. A very active conversation in media studies and visual culture. Yep, interesting, not solving that here. I am angry about peer review. I can't solve that here. This is all important, okay? But all I'm trying to do, remember, I'm starting an open access press. All I want is a level playing field. When I go to a provost or a department head and say, tell me what I have to do to publish stuff that will be received in a tenure and promotion package. Well, I mean, it's got to be like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Chicago. Okay, well, what does that mean? It has to be peer reviewed. Fine. Tell me what they did to peer review the work. I don't know. They just did. Okay, well, that's what we do. What we want is to share a system with them and us that shows the world how we're evaluating the work we bring to them and gives warrants to the authority we claim in scholarly publishing. That's all this is about. So, I think the next steps for this are we need to invite others into this work that we've just tried to start because we cannot finish what we've begun by ourselves. I mentioned I gave this talk to the AU Presses meeting. ACLS is now part of this conversation. The library folks we're sharing these ideas with and trying to get them engaged in the conversation. Here I am, now a member of OASPA. There are others that we need to engage because this needs to be a shared project if it's going to go anywhere at all. And importantly, it needs to involve the technologists who will solve for us the problem of how do we make sure this information is made part of the scholarly record in metadata. So, that's what I came to say. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to be here and for making me a member.
Okay, so OA books increasingly seem to be on the agenda, and recent years have seen the launch of a number of publishing programs experimenting with a range of models, as well as some dedicated funding streams. However, while we've seen some growth in publication numbers, OA books still represent only a small proportion of the scholarly monograph market, and barriers to further take-up remain. I'm going to look at some of the challenges for increasing publication options for and publication of open access monographs, and look ahead to some upcoming policy developments that could be influential in this area. I want to acknowledge a debt to the University's UK Open Access Monograph Group, on which I sit. We've been meeting for the last 2 years to discuss the future of OA monographs in the UK. We've held some workshops recently. I in no way claim to represent the views of that group, but what I present here has been influenced and inspired by some of our conversations. I'm also drawing on 5 years of personal experience publishing open access books at Palgrave Macmillan and latterly at Springer, in which time we've published more than 550 open access books. So, where are we now? As of June 2018, the Directory of Open Access Books listed just under 1,500 open access books with a publication of 2017. That's actually a fall of 3% from 2016. And to be clear, I'm not talking about books that were uploaded in 2017, but books with a publication year in 2017. Based on current trends in the DOAB, 2018 looks to be on course for growth of about 8%. And totals for these and previous years will continue to rise as publishers catch up with indexing backlogs, and as books are made retrospectively OA, perhaps. But from these figures, we can see that only a tiny proportion of all scholarly monographs are being published OA, and that if anything, growth seems to be slowing. I was struck by David's comments on Monday about the tiny scale of OA journals publishing 15 years ago. It was a cottage industry, he said. And although there are a lot of publishers with models, in many ways, I feel that we're in a similar sort of situation for OA books now. And while we can learn some lessons from our experiences of trying to expand OA in journals, the different nature of OA book publication compared to journal publication means that in increasing OA for books, we have to contend with a number of issues that don't apply in the case of journals. I don't think any of these are insurmountable, but we do need to find solutions, and we need to head them off at the beginning if open access is to grow significantly and if it's to grow soon. So let's start with the fact that OA book authors represent a very significantly different cohort from OA journal authors, and this brings with it challenges in engagement with, understanding of, and receptiveness to open access. The subject trends for OA books are notable. Analysis by Simba in 2017 showed that HSS disciplines make up 3/4 of all the books in DOAB, very much the reverse of the trend that we see for articles. That's not surprising. We know that monographs play a significant role in promotion and research evaluation for researchers in the humanities and the softer social sciences. These disciplines place more importance on monograph publication. They publish more books, and they almost certainly have more incentive to publish them open access. According to our analysis, social sciences, history, language and literature, and medicine are the most represented subjects in the DOAB. So the fact that we're dealing primarily with HSS authors means we're working with a group that, on average, has had much less exposure to open access than researchers in subjects where journals publishing predominates. And in fact, many authors publishing books are not that familiar with open access. When we surveyed our authors about the likelihood of their publishing their next book open access, 39% told us they weren't sufficiently familiar with open access to answer the question. And discipline plays a role here. So the only subject groups where we saw a difference in the answer was in life and the biomedical sciences and medicine, where we found that 33% told us that they couldn't answer the question, which is actually still higher than I would have expected. But given that HSS authors are more likely to publish monographs, their relative lack of familiarity means we face a challenge from the start in ensuring that these authors are sufficiently informed about both how OA works and what the benefits are. At Springer Nature, our editors are actively discussing OA options with prospective book authors. But we still hear from researchers, as Mark said, that they're concerned about perceptions of quality. And again, it's like it's 10 years ago in journals publishing. I feel like we're having all the same arguments over again. Mm-hmm. Even if authors themselves feel confident that OA books don't mean lower quality, they're still concerned that it will be seen as vanity publishing, that it might be considered differently in research assessments for internal promotion purposes. So, we need publishers to ensure that OA books are clearly seen to meet the same quality standards. And we need funders and institutions to demonstrate explicit support for OA book publication. And we need support from independent non-profit organizations like OASPA and the DOAB to help provide independent quality assurance. There are many positive developments here. When we surveyed authors earlier this year who were attending a workshop on open access, many were excited about the potential for their works to reach wider and more diverse audiences through publishing OA. They thought OA might help them raise the profile of their research, to reach readers who were not academics, who were not in, who were in the global south. So we're seeing signs of enthusiasm, although authors who choose to attend a workshop on open access books are by no means a neutral sample. We're also starting to see research emerge testifying to the benefits that OA can bring. And to Sven's point about sharing usage data, we do make data for all our books available to authors via the book metrics service. So every Springer Nature book has a book metrics page where you can see usage stats and alt metrics. In the last year, we at Springer Nature have also released a report, The OA Effect, showing that OA books receive 7 times the downloads of non-OA books, 50% more citations, and 10 times more online mentions. JSTOR and the 4 university presses that they piloted with, including Lara's UCL Press, have also shown impressive stats on the reach of OA books. We do have a great story to tell. We need more research like this, and we need to make sure that it's heard. And publishers, funders, and institutions all have a role here. This said, books differ from journals in a number of critical ways, and we must tackle these if we're to develop confidence in the idea of OA for books. Let's start with print, and I don't mean by this slide to suggest that books are exclusively print and journals are exclusively electronic, but I think we have to acknowledge that print remains really important to book publishing and to book authors, as we've already discussed here. And any book model, at least for the time being, needs to provide a print version. I don't see that as problematic, but I do think it's critical that we are really open in advertising that fact so that we can head off that concern amongst authors at the beginning. Another issue that comes up time and time again, has already come up today, is third-party rights. And book authors and HSS book authors in particular are much more likely to have to secure third-party rights than STEM authors. The rights are often more difficult to secure, and OA just makes that harder. Often third-party rights holders are not happy with their works being released under Creative Commons licenses. And we hear real concern from authors, especially those in subjects like art history and architecture, about how this will affect the integrity of their works if OA becomes mainstream. Experiments in blanking out figures in OA ebooks have not been well received. At Springer Nature, we compromise by releasing third-party material under a different license from the rest of the book if we can't secure OA permissions. And we ensure that rights holders are aware of what we're doing, that their work might be under copyright or under a more restrictive license, but that it's being published in a CC BY book. It's not perfect, it's the best solution we've found, but we need a consensus position to reassure authors. Scholarly books also differ significantly from each other, and there's a lot of concern about which book types might be expected to publish OA in any future policy mandates. Some academics in the humanities and social sciences publish with trade publishers. Even amongst academic presses, trade crossover titles are common. For these types of books, which require even more substantial editorial involvement and investment than books aimed at the academic market, which reach a different audience via a different model, the high costs involved may mean open access is not practical or that we don't currently have good models for it. And I think it's going to be difficult to engage trade presses. Finally, there's licensing. In journals, CC BY is very much the paradigm. We've seen that from the OASPA stats that were shared earlier. But there are loud voices in HSS who see this as inappropriate for their work. We need to ensure we have clear guidance that enables authors to understand the rights implications and benefits of the OA licenses, so that they're at least in a position to make informed choices. We need to recognize that this is an area which may need more flexibility than is the norm for journals. For example, authors may wish to retain control over translations of their work. At Springer Nature, we use CC BY as default, but if authors feel strongly that another license is more appropriate, then we're usually happy to accommodate that, providing that it doesn't conflict with their funders' requirements and that they've got a sound justification and it's not just based on a misunderstanding of what CC BY provides. So this brings me to publishers. Over the last few years, we've seen many established publishers roll out OA options for books. And we've also seen a number of really exciting new entrants to the market, notably in the new university presses and in scholar-led presses. But OA book options are still far from universal. Many of those that are offering OA books still appear to be doing it at a very small scale. And in some cases, it feels like it might be in a pilot phase, perhaps there's not that much information on the websites, there's low visibility. The publishing landscape for monographs is diverse and distributed, particularly in the humanities and social sciences. This is something to be prized. There are many small presses with long traditions and expertise in specific subjects. But there are also significant barriers to entry for any publisher considering launching an OA book program. And we need to make sure that any move to open access doesn't unduly damage this ecosystem which gives back so much to its subject communities. So, what are those barriers? Firstly, If you're a publisher and you want to offer open access for book, you have to invest substantially in editorial training so that editors feel confident speaking to authors about OA options. I would argue that publishers are currently taking on a great deal of the burden of the outreach to academics about open access books. Then let's talk about the implications for your workflow as a publisher, because it's going to affect all of it. So a new OA contract has to be developed to cover every type of OA book format or every contract you might have that would come into contact with an OA book. And we find that negotiation with partner organizations over contracts tends to be more complex than for non-open access. Depending on your model, you may also need mechanisms for invoicing. Internal systems and metadata must take account of OA, or else otherwise you'll need to manage this manually. The internal design of the book must include OA markup. Perhaps also the back cover to ensure it's really visible. Captions for third-party material need to explain under exactly what terms the material is shared. Websites need to flag the book's OA status and free availability, and ideally the license terms. And I haven't even got to the negotiations to ensure that OA books are freely available on third-party sites such as Amazon and Google and are displayed properly. And we've only just stopped having to upload books manually to the DOAB. And I could go on. How do you get librarians that aren't customers to include OA books in their catalog? How do you get aggregators to display OA books and make it clear that they're available open access? To summarize, it's complex, it's time-consuming, and there will inevitably be some manual workarounds at first. And those are costly and prone to error and not very scalable. I think we're in a bit of a chicken and egg situation where books require significant editorial involvement, they incur significant costs, and so does setting up a good OA workflow. And until it's clear that OA is going to be more than a niche enterprise, we may not see the investment that's needed, whether from individual publishers or from shared infrastructure, in order to provide for greater scale. So if you'll excuse a massive cliche, this brings me to the elephant in the room, which is the role of funders and the funding and policy structures needed to bring about higher levels of open access. We've heard a lot this week about the role of funders in driving open access. But for books, this is only happening in a really limited way. We're aware of just 21 research funders and 42 institutions worldwide that have some kind of requirement that researchers make some version of their books and chapters openly available. Of this, there are just 10 funders that require or prefer use of the CC BY license. In case you think, that doesn't sound so bad to me, by comparison, we're aware of 132 funders and 389 institutions with some kind of OA requirement for journals. It's a very stark difference. Let's look at funding. We see a similar trend. 18 funders, 47 institutions worldwide, which formally make some funding available for OA books, though some of it might be through remaining grant funds. And in the case of institutions, it's typically the same fund that's used for article funding, and the fund caps mean that effectively this could support a chapter, maybe a short book, but ultimately isn't enough to fund a full-length monograph. And to give you the comparison again, we're aware of 104 funders and 193 institutions that are formally funding OA articles. So OA books are very much the poor cousin. So what's next? It depends. There are a small number of major funders, and it won't surprise you to hear that these include the Wellcome Trust and the Austrian Science Foundation, that have been extremely progressive in developing policies and funding models for open access books. There are signs of further movement. In the UK, the UKRI is including books in its current OA policy review. It's indicated that we should expect some kind of OA book requirement for their next research excellence framework. On a broader scale, as we've heard, the Plan S manifesto indicates that its signatory funders see an OA future for books as well as for journals, if perhaps not to the same timescale. That could be transformative, and I really believe that this kind of broad funder support and engagement will be critical if we're to see real change. I think books deserve to be open access. I think the authors of books and those in the humanities and social sciences deserve the opportunity to make their research open access, and I encourage you all to join me in making this a reality. Thank you.
Hi, Matt Day from Cambridge University Press. So I think we have some good evidence, and there's other evidence that going open access can certainly support downloads and even print sales. But I'm not so sure about the relationship between like key free Kindle versions or other versions that make it much easier for authors, for readers to get hold of and actually read the open access version. I'm wondering if any of the panelists know more about this than me and can give us a little bit of insight.
I guess I'll take that one and say we have really struggled to get meaningful usage data out of Amazon for our OA books. So, it's bad enough anyway that you're sort of taking usage stats from many different places and trying to reconcile them when they may not all be using the same stats. But actually, Amazon seem extremely reluctant to release anything, and therefore I can't really help you.
Hi, I'm Pramita Chatterjee from B Press. This is another question for Ros. Ros, I was wondering, with the data that you had around funding for OA books, does that include OA textbooks too? I'm just, we're seeing a lot of funding institutionally and funder-wise for OA textbooks in the US. And so I was just wondering how your data accommodates that.
Yeah, we've been focusing exclusively on open access for research works, so we haven't really, that funding data relates only to scholarly monographs, edited collections, and other things in there, not to OA textbooks. But I would be really interested to to understand the sort of appetite for that. My sense is it's a very different market, and there will be a different set of funders that would be interested in supporting that.
Hi, this is Anke Beck from Intech Open. I very much appreciate your comment to introduce a sort of label for peer reviewing, because I'm completely annoyed by all the discussion what good or bad peer reviewing is. And I think as soon as all of us could make this transparent, we wouldn't have the discussions to prove the quality. This is one comment, and I think that my company would certainly like to join that movement. I think it's pretty good. So the more transparency, the better. But the other comment is what Sven hinted at, that it's not the publishers which are the bottleneck. To me, it's really the funders, and it is libraries which are the bottleneck. My understanding from the entire open access market regarding libraries is that open access money can only be set apart from the overall budget, so there is no additional budget for open access. And if the main or the bulk of the funding goes to journals, of course, then less and less is left for books as such. And I really wonder whether we don't need to radically rethink what we fund, because to me a book is nothing else but like a special issue in a journal. So I think we have to radically rethink the perception of what we fund. Do we fund a subject, or do we fund a product line, which is either a book or a journal? So I would like to give that back for discussion.
So thanks for your support. I welcome it, and I also want to be very clear that one of the things we're not doing with what we propose is saying to publishers how they should do peer review. We understand that every publisher makes that choice with a view to that publisher's audience. That's for the publisher to decide. All we want is to propose the idea that among publishers we should have some standard understandings of what we mean when we say these things. But I would actually come to your second point just briefly, because my experience differs, I think, from Sven's. I have a job because libraries decided they were fed up with the existing system and wanted to create an alternative. So my experience of libraries actually is that many of them are very creative and forward-thinking. My experience of the bottleneck, I would more like describe it as the cured concrete, is scholars in my fields. That it is the scholars themselves, and especially senior scholars, who are very, very reluctant to move forward with different modes of publishing. And I would relate that to a broader observation that I think actually in my world, it's not the crisis in scholarly publishing, it's the crisis in the humanities. We're just one little sort of symptom of that departments are closing, universities are just eviscerating humanities programs, we heard yesterday about the number of contingent faculty. It's like the whole of the humanities is in a moment of crisis, and what institutions do in that moment is to fall back onto received signals of credibility and prestige. So I understand that. That's where I think we live. To make the change, I have to approach it in terms of trying to understand the choice architecture that's involved here. That's my interest.
But I don't disagree with you, so.
Yeah, I think so. First of all, I didn't say that librarians are not creative or innovative or something like that. I just said that they are a bottleneck regarding funding, right? Let's be careful in the times of social media. Otherwise, everybody will yell at me within the next 10 minutes. So I'm very much aware of that, and it is even not my opinion, independent of social media. I think what's really interesting is that there is more and more libraries that understand that a stable commitment to open access is what is most important. So all these initiatives, about 2.5% of the library budgets or whatever it is, that there is stability in how libraries endorse open access and act upon it. I think that's really important. It is not that 100% of the funding have to move from traditional sources to traditional acquisition to open access, in my view at least. But what I think is interesting, and Ros has almost not mentioned that issue, that's probably a Springer nature advantage over others, is the role of trade partners. Because I think the difficulty is that a lot of smaller publishers particularly are not in touch with libraries as their major group of customers directly, but just indirectly, through ProQuest, through EBSCO, whatever, these companies. And they are completely silent in this space and always say, yeah, we are kind of supporting open access, but if you want concrete proof to that, they say, well, that's for the next board meeting. And I think that is one of the major problems if you don't have direct reach as Springer Nature and others have into libraries. That's really a difficulty that we have to address if we really want to shift budgets together with libraries from their traditional acquisition into open access. And I think that's a little bit of a different approach than the diamond funding mark that you are doing, where the institution, where the researcher is working, is basically paying for their books. So I think we have different institutional funding mechanisms here, which I think is great. There has never been just one source of funding in academic publishing, so that's great. We just need to make sure that we get it right and that it's clear what libraries are paying for and what they want for it. And that is quality in peer review, which is really something that they can see, that they have proof for. I completely agree there. I think everything that makes these qualitative statements about peer review less qualitative, but more factual, so that you can really measure it, that you can see who has which peer review has been done to a specific piece of content. I think that's great. So I really like the initiative to make it as visible and transparent as possible. And I can't imagine that there are so many people who have anything against it, because it's just basically displaying what you're doing anyways, which other people call marketing. So.
I mean, I do think the sort of third-party aggregators and the routes through which we reach libraries are very problematic, because trying to get OA books displayed properly in them is a real challenge. And that, you were talking about kind of double dipping. I think most publishers are, actively excluding any, I would hope, any open access book from an ebook collection. We reduced the price of print because we acknowledge that a lot of the costs, the pre-press costs, have been covered by the VPC. But how do we get all the aggregators to act responsibly towards open access books? And if they're not going to, then do we have a better solution to mediate?
We don't need too many, right? There are just a few who hold a large market share. And I think both publishers and libraries together have to put pressure on them and say, if you don't comply, you are in trouble. Because they know already that there are solutions to this. It is just technology, nothing else. It is just basically putting a mark to a mark record or whatever in a collection saying this title has been funded in open access through X, Y, and Z. And you can do that in Oasis, in Gobi, in all these systems. So it is not difficult, it is just that you have to do it at this point. And I think publishers and librarians alike can push there.
Can I ask a question? I have a question for Sven, actually. So you mentioned I totally agree. You mentioned the importance of impact, and the whole argument for what I'm offering to authors and to institutions who choose to invest in a proposition like ours is impact, right? But why am I worried about getting really granular about use data for these works? It seems to me that it's a very short step from there to the world of an impact factor for publishers or for university presses, which I think would be a very bad world. We would not evaluate the quality of existing presses on the basis of the number of times their book had been checked out of the library. Because if we did, we'd have a very different picture of the world than we do now. So I just really worry about that. I mean, sometimes, publishing is itself a gesture toward the future. We don't know what works we publish will be useful in the future. We shouldn't, I'm not sure that should, it will inflect our decisions if we become answerable to that kind of way of seeing the data. Yes, no?
Well, I think my point is that I would like to replace brand recognition of a publisher with facts. They are historical facts. They are not the facts on the specific book or the specific program, but just an overall number. But if you hear early career academics, what their concern is, they say the first real book I have to publish with a really great press. And then they have like 5 names at the hand, and that's it. There might not be a factual justification for those publishers because they haven't proven to be the most active ones in open access. I mean, just with regards to open access. Of course, they might do good work in other things and other fields. But I think it's really important to say, why is a great brand a great brand? Not just because my grandpa has already published there, but because they deliver something which is tangible. That's a kind of plébiscite tous les jours, right? So you have to do that in a lot of disciplines, and I think publishers have to get used to the fact that they are being evaluated as well. Because that's the fact anyways already in libraries. I mean, how do you spend money in libraries? Based on certain perceptions and hopefully some metrics. And I'm happy if the number of perceptions is being reduced, or the share of perception and the share of numbers is being increased.
But can I just comment on that? I don't think there are facts if you start counting stuff, because it's really very difficult to come to any sensible conclusion about the impact of a book if you count mentions or citations or downloads. And we don't actually know what we count when we count downloads. There are many different ways to do that. You can count chapter downloads and book downloads, and you can sort of think, well, then we multiply the book by the number of chapters, and we add that. And so we enter a new big mess, actually. So if we are going to figure out how to work with numbers, I think we should be very careful. That's not going to tell us a lot about the success of open access publishing. It is evident that open access does a lot of good to the reach of books, to the number of people that come into contact with books. So that's great, and we should try and find out how that works. But just thinking that we're there, that we have some numbers and it'll prove anything, I think is dangerous, because people far further removed from let's say humanities book publishing will run away with it. They will start thinking about so why don't we start counting money that we supply to this faculty, and there are so many people working there, but the impact is very low, and so there is a danger there.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think we need to guard against any kind of reductive measure of books that is based purely on quantitative stats. I think there's 2 challenges here. One is, as you say, the usage doesn't necessarily tell you about the wider impact, because a book could have had a very sort of specific impact on a particular area which isn't measured through its how many people have downloaded it. Might be that a small number of people who have really benefited from that book or been able to build on it have been able to access it, and that could be more impactful than your thousands of downloads. Going back to the question of publishers and brand and usage as a way of trying to get away from the kind of old sort of received wisdom about brand. I think there's a risk in using usage to do that, because actually what publishers do isn't just about providing discoverability, and that's as true for open access books as it is for non-open access books. There is a care that goes into that. There are a lot of other supporting functions that publishers provide along the way from the beginning of the commissioning process. Not all of that is captured in a metric.
I will have to disagree, but I think Danny is first.
This is a sort of logistic question. So at the Open Access Monograph session last week, a lot of the conversation that came through was concern about discoverability of books. And there was a talk by somebody who said that they'd chosen a particular publisher specifically because they were hoping that that would make their book more available, and they were deeply upset that there wasn't a review in the whichever review, New York Review of Books or whatever it was that they were hoping for. And this points to my complete ignorance of this market. In the traditional book market, how do people find out about books? Because it sounds like you have to get yourself a review, which means that the people who run the London Review of Books or whatever are the people who actually are the toll masters and have potentially all the power. And how is that then sort of counted in an open access environment? Like, is this an advantage of selling the open access book? If that is actually the mechanism for distributing books and getting people to know about them, that sounds really inefficient and really 20th century. And if you've got an open access alternative where we can tell people about things in a different way, isn't that a good way of us selling the open access message? I don't know. I don't know the answer. I'm just asking.
I think it's clear that reviews are probably the most highly valued thing that come out of a book. So when it gets reviewed, that's what authors find most important. It's totally different from journal publishing and from articles, and it's an important part of journals, actually, reviews. And so that's something that really puts books apart. And it's very undigital, you know. It's really. And I'm not sure there are ways around that system. I think it works really well and it's highly valued. So we'll just have to work with it. And what we could do and try to do collectively is make these reviews much more discoverable, attach them to the actual book so that you can click through, that you can actually find them, because that's really hard work. There are courses for scholars to learn to find reviews of books, and that could be so much easier if we work on it. And so, but the system of reviews is something that is extremely valuable, particularly in the humanities.
So I would like to defend the scholars who actually are really interested in publishing open access books and have limited venues for doing that. And so you're absolutely right when you say that for a first book in particular, the one on which you might now have your tenured job, increasingly fewer and fewer tenured jobs, but still, do have to be with a prestigious press, not necessarily only 5 of them, but one that's recognizable. My question is how to open up the possibility among those publishers for an open access possibility if a scholar wanted to publish that way. Because I do think there are a lot of people that I know that really believe in that, but they don't, you know, and they're not opposed to going to Lever or something, but they're also would really like to stay with the press that maybe they've published their last 3 books with, and they still want to go with that press. So that's just my question.
Well, I would say that there is a inverse relationship, a relation between prestigious presses and their openness to open access in the market, and I think that has led into a situation where we are now. That's also true, by the way, for the issue of book reviews. If these presses, if these top presses would just treat the content they are publishing in another business model exactly the same way they treat their paid-for versions of a digital book, it would be really difficult to kind of miss the argument that these prestigious presses have an open access policy. But if you look into the numbers, by the way, again, and if you see that there, you can pick any of these prestigious presses and see how many open access books they have been publishing as a share of their overall portfolio. And you will see that that is much lower on average than for other presses. So I think they are caught in their own behavior, and if they don't change this way, that they don't really actively promote the fact that they publish open access, academics will not find out. So if I was responsible for one of these prestigious presses, I would say let's get the message out. Let's make sure that we have our calculation in place, that this works economically for us as a business, but let's tell everybody and let's not defend our legacy businesses because we are so much in love with them and our sales force needs something to do, and all these arguments which are organizational arguments that are good but not good enough for researchers to respond to that. So I think it is really a consequence of conscious activity or leadership or lack of leadership, whatever you want to call it, within these presses.
I just said that it also involves an openness of the funder, because many funders, I'm not talking about those people here in the room, so there are many others, and they talk to us as publisher, or also, I should say, in my previous job, about the quality of the paper, and that you have a minimum of print in your stock in order to receive any funding, but they have never asked me for the quality of the digital book. So I think that is also, adding just to the educational part, which has been discussed already.
Yeah. So that's why, probably to add that's why I'm so enthusiastic about initiatives like Lever Press and others, because they are just showing the prestigious publishers that there is an alternative. And if they don't change the way they do things, it will be difficult for them, because this is kind of eating away books that are a potential acquisition for other publishers. So in that respect, I think everybody by now in the market has understood what's happening. I think the conversations around REF in the United Kingdom are probably a good political inflection point where a lot of presses rethink their policies, and I think that will kickstart open access books much more than we've seen it so far.
I think, what impact factor is to journals, then the kind of brand and prestige of certain university presses is to books. And I guess we're going to, as we keep going with open access books, then if that predominates, then we might hit the same problems that we've seen with open access for journals. And that is an institutional problem to do with institutional systems of promotion and reward. Yeah,
but also I think we have to be careful that open access is not like the point of crystallization for all issues in the academy. The tenure track problems in the United Kingdom, for example, have nothing to do with open access, but are a problem in itself. Third-party rights are an issue for academic publishing once it becomes digital anyways. So I think what we should really do also in these conferences, let's focus on what we have an impact on, and let's make sure that we don't always broaden the field too much into like brand perception, impact factor, peer review, There are so many things out there, but we can't address them all in one conference. That's why we have so many of these conferences, I guess. So it's probably a good idea to tackle one after the other. And I think what Mark suggested, a very pragmatic approach to, which I find very pragmatic to peer review, just put a stamp on it and say how it had been done. That's a great solution. And if everybody agrees with that, well, let's sign off on it and get over the conversation and next thing. So, but I think it needs to result in action and not just in conversation. So that's why I liked your idea so much here.
Can I just add, if Lara were here, and I wish she were, she would be saying at this moment, let's get out of the conversation about publishing and open access publishing. It's all publishing. Let's not exoticize this thing called open access publishing, because that moves it in the conversation into this special little box that has to be sort of translated and interpreted. Let's not do that. Let's just say it's all publishing. And what we offer is a different path to the audience. That's my entire value proposition to the author. I want to live in that world and not in a world where what I do is some sort of specialized form of publishing. Speaking for Lara, who should be here.
Well done. I have one, I think we should be sort of finalizing this, but I have one issue I'd like to raise, which was from probably the oldest delegate during our conference, Jean-Claude Guédon, who said, we were talking about books and journals, he said, this is all going away. We're in a digital revolution, and these formats are going to somehow disappear, and we'll have a different, they're all content items, and we'll be able to mix them and use them in different ways, and they can be in the same, run through the same systems. And what we've been doing in the past, let's say, couple of hours is talk about something very specific that came through the ages in the form of a book that now is caught up in a digital revolution, and there are different publishers that are still not there, and they're actually, they haven't actually entered the digital revolution with their books. There are others that have completely transformed their whole system, and they have a digital workflow, and they look at books as other sort of content items that you could compare with journals and articles, and actually it's the same system. Also for their distribution, so it's a totally different workflow. So the publishing workflow is very varied. And this also relates to, I think, the remarks about, a very diverse landscape, and you called it fragmented. So how do we see that happening? Is the book something that will disappear pretty quickly, or are we going to live with the book as a cultural and scholarly artifact for a long time? Any thoughts about that?
I hesitate greatly to disagree with Jean-Claude, but I think I'll be contracting books for my career. However, I will say what I see emerging are, I don't think those two categories are breaking down, but I think another category is emerging between them. So I think we've had this binary of the 10,000 word article or the 100,000 word book. And we're publishing books now that are 40, 50,000 words. They're sort of giving humanists an opportunity to make a sustained argument about an issue in the public square that really doesn't need to be 100,000 words long. And we can do that because we don't really have to worry about the peculiar economics of justifying a print run. So I think that's possible, more forms, but the two forms we've received, I don't see that going away soon.
Yeah, I would echo that. We've seen enormous support and interest in publishing sort of mid-length formats. And I think over time, as new systems develop, we will see books start to benefit from many of the things that journals have had for years. So, I mean, DOIs at some point will become absolutely standard for every chapter. And so we'll start to see those kind of benefits of kind of better metadata, better kind of identifiers for books as well as for journals. I mean, I think, as you've said, some publishers are already starting on that, including us. It will take time, but I mean, I don't think we're so far off that. And if you kind of add to that the mid formats, in some ways we're already there. But I also agree with Mark that the sort of the book as an outlet for humanities and social sciences scholarship as the way to develop your argument over the long form, I don't think that's going away.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there are two answers to it, and we always have this issue of whether, of what we produce books for, just because we have always done it in the past or not. I personally have to say, I love books, but you shouldn't care, because it's completely unimportant to the audience. I think it's really important that we publish in formats that really meet researchers' demands. The question is how long that should be. We have seen a lot of changes, for example, in the German context regarding PhD dissertations, where you can work in a cumulative way now. I think that will have an impact. So far, that was primarily something in the STM fields that might move into other fields like HSS as well. So I think as long as people feel that they need the format, why would we care? As long as we feel that as a publishing industry and also as librarians, that there is a way, a transition basically from an idea into something written to communicate it, that's fine. I'm really interested in seeing, and we work with one of these initiatives at Knowledge Unlatched, what will happen to audiovisual material. Will that become more important in research communication? So videos, for example, on certain issues. That's something that I'm really interested in and would look more into. So does that replace some of the arguments and especially the complex arguments that are being covered in books in the future in another medium.
Thank you, and thank everyone.